25 years after she left the only town that ever knew her real name, a millionaire walked back into Milbrook Hollow wearing a waitress apron and carrying a grief she hadn't finished paying for. When the most powerful man in the county backed her into a corner in front of a room full of regulars, nobody at the counter moved. Nobody except the mechanic in the second booth, a man who had once promised to marry her and had spent 2.5 decades believing she'd simply stopped loving him. He didn't know who she was. He only knew what was happening in front of him was wrong. What neither of them could have guessed that morning was that the answer to everything they'd lost was already sitting in a small metal box 2 blocks away, in a bank that belonged to the very man doing the humiliating, waiting for someone to finally ask for the key. Milbrook Hollow sat in the kind of Tennessee Valley that mapmakers included, out of obligation rather than relevance, a town of 1,100 people, 1 blinking traffic light, and a main street that had been slowly emptying out since the feed store closed in the 90s. There was a hardware store that still opened 6 days a week out of habit more than profit, a Baptist church with a gravel lot that filled twice a week, a county courthouse with limestone steps worn soft in the middle from 100 years of boots, and beyond the last stoplight, county roads that ran out past fences and cattle gates into land that had belonged to the same families for generations, until it hadn't. The Bluebird diner had survived where almost nothing else had, mostly because Ruth Ann Dawes had refused to let it die, and partly because the coffee was still $1.10, and nobody in 3 counties made a biscuit like hers. Ruth was 74 now, her hands starting to shake in the mornings before they steadied over the griddle, and she had run that diner for 41 years, the last 18 of them alone, since her husband Walt had passed. What almost nobody in town remembered anymore, because it had never mattered enough to remember, was that the little lot the diner sat on had never technically belonged to the Dawes family at all. It belonged on paper nobody had looked at in decades to the Mercers, under an old handshake arrangement that had never once been tested, going back to a summer when Ruth's husband and Carly's grandfather had settled the whole matter over a plate of eggs and a promise neither man had ever felt the need to write down. Carly Mercer stepped off a rented sedan onto the gravel shoulder outside the church on a Tuesday morning in April, wearing a black dress that had cost more than most people in town made in a month, though nobody there would have known it to look at her. She had flown into Nashville the night before, driven the last hour herself instead of hiring a car, because she wasn't ready yet to arrive as someone people would look at twice. Her mother was gone. Eleanor Mercer had died in her sleep, 9 days earlier in the same White House at the edge of town where Carly had grown up, the same house with the wraparound porch and the 2 crooked steps that had never once, in Carly's lifetime, gotten fixed, the same kitchen window that looked out over a garden Eleanor had kept tending, out of stubbornness more than need, well into her 70s. The funeral that morning was small, the way her mother would have wanted it, 20 or so people in wooden pews that still smelled faintly of the cedar oil the caretaker used every spring, the same hymnal numbers on the board that had hung there since Carly was a girl. Ruth sat near the front, in the pew that had been hers for 40 years, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that had been Eleanor's own, given to her years ago as a small, ordinary gift between 2 women who had shared a friendship deep enough that gifts like that didn't need occasions. Elton Pruitt sat 2 rows back in a suit that had clearly been pressed for the occasion, his hands folded, his face doing the particular still, careful grief of a man who has buried a great many friends and clients over the years and has learned to carry it quietly. Carly stood at the graveside afterward, long after the small crowd had thinned, looking down at the fresh dirt beside her father's older headstone, and found herself thinking not of the sickness that had taken her mother, nor even of the years of distance between them, but of a single memory from childhood, her mother's hands guiding hers over a mixing bowl in that same kitchen, teaching her to fold batter the careful way, instead of stirring it rough, a small, unimportant memory that arrived. In that moment, as the whole weight of everything she'd lost, Carly had built something with her life in the years since she left this valley. She'd started with a marketing job in Nashville that she'd gotten because she outworked everyone in the interview room, sleeping 4 hours a night for the better part of 2 years, learning an industry from the ground floor because nobody was going to hand her anything, certainly not a girl from a town most of her colleagues had never heard of. 11 years later, she owned the company outright, Meridian Brand Partners, a mid-sized firm with clients across 4 states and a name that meant something in rooms Milbrook Hollow had never heard of and never would. She had a condominium in Nashville she barely lived in, an assistant who managed half her calendar better than she could herself, and a life that most people would have called, without hesitation, a success story. None of that showed on her now, standing at the edge of a gravel church lot in a plain black dress, her hair pulled back the way her mother used to wear hers, looking like exactly what she was underneath everything else. A woman who had just lost the last person alive who remembered her as a girl. That evening, alone in the quiet house, Carly began the slow work of sorting through a lifetime of drawers, the particular exhausting grief of deciding what to keep and what to let go. A box of Christmas ornaments here, a drawer of expired coupons there, the small useless archaeology of an ordinary life. In an old cigar box tucked beneath a stack of church bulletins, she found a small brass key. It wasn't a house key. It was too small, too flat, stamped along one edge with a number, 91, and beneath the number, 3 faint letters worn nearly smooth from handling, FCB. There was no note, no explanation. Just the key, wrapped once in a handkerchief that still smelled faintly of her mother's hand lotion, tucked away like something that mattered enough to keep and not enough, or not safe enough, to explain out loud to anyone, even to a daughter she called every Sunday for years. Carly sat at the kitchen table turning it over in her fingers for a long time, before she finally set it aside and went upstairs to the childhood bedroom that still had the same curtains, unable yet to guess what it might open, or why her mother had never once mentioned it in all those Sunday calls. She took it the next morning to Elton Pruitt, the tired, kind attorney who had handled Mercer family business for 3 decades and had known her father before he passed. His office smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco, shelves crowded with case files going back further than Carly had been alive, a window unit rattling in the June heat even though it was only April. Elton turned the key over in his fingers, adjusted his glasses and told her after a moment that FCB stood for First County Bank and that the number matched a safe deposit box, one that had sat under Eleanor's name and under a joint authorization that had never once been updated. For as long as he could remember handling the family's affairs, getting into it wouldn't be simple, he warned her gently, folding his hands on the desk in the way he did when he was about to deliver news he knew wouldn't be welcome. Boxes under joint or unclear authorization required the estate to be formally settled first, paperwork filed, a death certificate on record with the bank itself, a signature from whoever currently managed the box's registration on the bank's side. Hilton looked apologetic delivering that particular piece of news because everyone in town, including him, knew exactly whose signature that would eventually require. The man who had run First County Bank for going on 30 years. Wallace Briggs. It was in that same meeting, almost as an afterthought, folded in among the general business of an estate, that Elton mentioned the diner. Ruth Dawes's note, he said, had ballooned into something that made no sense on paper. Penalties stacked on penalties, and the bank was 2 months from calling it entirely. He'd looked at it himself out of concern for an old family friend, and something about the numbers didn't sit right with him, though he couldn't say exactly what without digging deeper than his workload allowed, a small county practice with more clients than hours in the week. Carly sat with both pieces of news, the key and the diner side by side in her lap like 2 separate small stones, and didn't yet see, couldn't have seen, that they were the same thread pulled from 2 different ends of the same 25 years. She didn't go looking for a fight. She went looking mostly for a place to be nobody for a while, because the house was too quiet at night and the key had no answer waiting behind it yet, and because grief, she was learning all over again, needed somewhere ordinary to sit while it did its slow work. Ruth needed help at the counter, her knees not what they used to be. The girl who'd been covering breakfasts having left for Knoxville without much notice, and Carly, standing in Ruth's kitchen in a pair of borrowed jeans and an old flannel shirt of her mother's, asked if she could pick up the shift. Ruth, who hadn't seen Carly Mercer in 25 years, and did not recognize the quiet, careful woman standing in front of her, said yes, without asking many questions, because she needed the help, and because there was something about this stranger she liked immediately without being able to say why, a steadiness in the way she carried herself that reminded Ruth, though she couldn't place it, of Eleanor. She told Ruth her name was Carly. It was true enough. She left off the rest and told herself it was a small enough thing to carry for now, at least until the box was open, and she understood what she was actually dealing with. The first morning she worked the counter, she saw him before he saw her. Jake Hollis came in at 6:40, same as he had for years, ordered coffee black and 2 eggs over easy, sat in the second booth by the window where the morning light came in flat and gold across the Formica, the same booth he had claimed every working morning for over a decade. He was 48 now, broader through the shoulders than the boy she remembered, grey coming in at his temples, a face that had clearly done its share of worrying in the years since she'd last seen it, deep lines around the eyes that spoke of long hours and harder nights. He ran the Hollis auto shop 2 blocks down, the same shop his father had run before him, a low brick building with 2 bays and a hand-painted sign that hadn't been repainted since the 80s. He had a 16-year-old daughter named Sarah, who was, according to the easy talk that moved up and down the counter every morning, the best thing that had ever happened to him. His wife Denise had died 6 years earlier. Cancer, quick and cruel the way it sometimes is, 11 months from diagnosis to funeral, and he had raised Sarah alone since, quietly, the way he did most things, learning to braid hair from an internet video the year she turned 10 because there was nobody else left to teach him. Carly set his coffee down and her hand did not shake, though everything in her wanted it to. He said thank you, without looking up from his paper. He did not know her. 25 years had put lines in her face he'd never seen, and had taken the girl entirely out of the way she stood. And he had no reason in the world to look for her behind the eyes of a new waitress at Ruth's counter. She walked back to the kitchen and stood at the pass window a moment longer than she needed to, watching him read, watching the small, familiar way he turned each page, and she understood in that instant that whatever she had told herself about why she was staying in this town beyond the funeral, it wasn't the whole truth anymore, and hadn't been since the moment she'd seen him sit down. The weeks that followed built themselves slowly, the way real things do. Carly learned the rhythms of the Bluebird, learned which regulars wanted their coffee refilled without asking, and which wanted to be left alone with their crossword, learned that Dolores Frayne took her tea with lemon and complained about her hip every morning without fail, learned that the Whitcomb boys from the feedlot came in loud and left a mess and tipped better than anyone else on the route, learned that Marcus Yates from the pharmacy across the street always ordered the same tuna melt on Fridays and always left a folded newspaper behind for whoever wanted it next. She learned, too, mostly by watching, who really carried weight in Milbrook Hollow, and it was not the mayor, a genial, mostly ceremonial man named Purcell, who ran the hardware store and spent most council meetings talking about the football field's drainage. It was Wallace Briggs, 63 now, silver-haired, always pressed even on a Saturday, who held the note on half the farms and half the storefronts within 20 miles, who came into the Bluebird most mornings around 8 after the working crowd cleared out, and who had, in the 6 years since Ruth's knees had started giving her trouble, developed the habit of speaking to her the way a man speaks to hired help, rather than to the woman who'd fed half the town through 2 recessions and a flood. Carly watched him do it the first week and said nothing, because she wasn't yet sure what she was watching, only that something about the way this town moved around this one man felt less like respect and more like fear wearing respect's clothes. She noticed, too, the small ways people managed him, the careful cheerfulness of a farmer settling his bill, the particular attentiveness of the hardware store owner whenever Wallace's truck pulled up outside. It was Elton, over a second cup of coffee one slow Wednesday, who told her, without quite meaning to gossip, that Wallace Briggs had come up from nothing himself, the son of a tenant farmer who'd worked land he'd never owned, and had spent 30 years making absolutely certain that nobody would ever again be able to look at him the way people once looked at his father. That fact didn't excuse anything Carly would later learn, but it stayed with her, a small human thread in a man she'd otherwise have been tempted to see as simply cruel. Jake noticed her, before he understood why he was noticing her. It started small. The way she held her coffee mug with both hands, wrapped all the way around it even when it wasn't cold enough to need warming, a habit she'd had since she was a girl standing at her mother's stove on winter mornings, waiting for Eleanor to finish the biscuits. He'd seen that exact gesture somewhere before and couldn't place it, and it bothered him in the low, persistent way small, unplaced memories do. Then it was the way she hummed under her breath while wiping down the counter at the end of a shift, some tune he didn't recognize the words to, but recognized the shape of, something that had once come out of a car radio on a summer night a long time ago. He told himself it was nothing. New people reminded you of old people sometimes. That was just what memory did to a man past 45, who'd buried a wife and was raising a teenager alone, and didn't have a lot of spare attention left over for chasing down half-formed feelings. The two of them talked more than either planned to, the way people do at a counter over months of the same 6:40 coffee. She asked him about the shop, about Sarah, about how he'd kept the place running after his father passed, and he found himself telling her things he didn't usually tell strangers, about how hard the last 6 years had been since Denise died, about how he'd built the whole business back up almost by hand, one loyal customer at a time, working 60-hour weeks that first year just to keep the lights on and Sarah in her school clothes, about how proud he was of his daughter's grades and her stubborn streak, about how scared he was some nights that the bank might decide his note wasn't worth carrying anymore because a shop like his ran thin margins in a town this size, and he had nothing set aside beyond what Sarah would need for college. He didn't know why he trusted a woman he'd known for a matter of weeks with things like that. He just did. The way you trust certain people without being able to explain the mechanism of it. There were smaller moments, too, in those early weeks that mattered more than either of them said out loud. A rainy Tuesday when the diner was near empty and Jake stayed past his usual half hour, telling her unprompted about the year after Denise died, when he'd nearly lost the shop to grief alone, when Sarah was 10 and scared and he didn't know how to be both mother and father at once, and how it had been Ruth, mostly, who'd fed the two of them dinner 3 nights a week that whole first year, without ever once making it feel like charity. A Sunday afternoon, when Sarah herself came by after school, doing homework in the corner booth, and asked Carly with the blunt curiosity only a 16-year-old possesses, whether she had kids of her own, and Carly said no, not yet, and something crossed her face that Sarah, sharp the way her father was sharp, noticed and filed away without comment. A slow Thursday when Jake fixed the diner's stubborn back door hinge without being asked, refusing payment, and Ruth pressed a slice of pie on him anyway, and Carly watched the two of them argue gently over it, and felt for the first time in longer than she could remember, something that felt almost like belonging. Carly, for her part, watched him become the man he'd become, and it did something to her she hadn't expected when she'd first tied on Ruth's spare apron. She had spent 25 years imagining, in the rare moments she let herself imagine it at all, usually late at night after a long week of meetings in glass conference rooms, that Jake Hollis had probably forgotten her the way you forget a season, moved on into an entirely different life that had never once included her. Instead, she found a man who had built a life out of showing up, day after day, for people who needed him, who had raised a daughter with a gentleness that spoke of a wound he'd healed rather than one he was still bleeding from, who fixed strangers' cars for less than they cost him when he thought nobody would notice, who drove Dolores Frayne to her doctor's appointments in Chattanooga twice a month without being asked because her own son never came around anymore. She had loved a boy once, fiercely, the way you only love at 19. She found herself, against every rule she'd made for herself, starting to love the man that boy had become before he had any idea who she was, and that particular kind of loving frightened her more than anything in her professional life ever had. It came apart on a Thursday morning in June. The diner was 3/4 full, the after-church crowd mixing with the regular breakfast shift, forks and low conversation, and the smell of bacon thick in the air, when Wallace Briggs walked in, wearing the particular expression of a man who had already decided how his morning was going to go. He'd come, it turned out, not for eggs, but for Ruth, carrying a folder of his own under one arm, and he found Carly at the counter instead, and Carly was holding a tray of coffee cups when he stopped in front of her and told her, loudly enough for the whole room to hear, that certain families in this town had a way of thinking they were owed something just for having a name people remembered, that the diner's debt situation was about to become considerably less comfortable for Ruth if certain arrangements weren't made soon, and that a girl carrying trays for a living ought to mind her tone with men who held paper on half the county. Carly felt the tray tremble in her hands, not from fear but from a fury she couldn't yet name, and when Ruth came out from the kitchen to intervene, wiping her hands on her apron, worry plain on her face, Wallace waved her off without even looking at her. Carly, her voice tight but steady, told him she thought Ruth had always paid on time. He stepped in close enough that she had to choose whether to step back, and he told her that girls who worked counters for a living didn't get to correct men who held the paper on half the county. He reached out and knocked the tray from her hands. It hit the floor and every cup on it broke, ceramic scattering in a wide arc across the checkerboard tile, coffee spreading dark across the floor. The diner went silent, the way a held breath goes silent. 20 or so people who Carly had served coffee to for 2 months looked down at their plates, at their hands, at anything that wasn't the scene in front of them. Ruth stood frozen by the kitchen door. Dale Whitcomb, who'd complained about his own rate not 2 weeks before, kept his eyes on his eggs. Dolores Frayne stared hard into her tea. Nobody moved. 6 seconds passed. Then 8. Carly, kneeling now to gather what she could of the broken cups, understood with a clarity that felt almost physical exactly what this silence was answering. A question she hadn't consciously asked but had come to this town, in some buried way, needing an answer to all along, whether anyone in a room full of people would speak for a woman who appeared, on the surface of things, to have nothing at all. Jake Hollis stood up from the second booth without hurrying, the way a man stands up when he's already decided something, and the deciding part is over. He crossed the diner floor and stopped between Carly and Wallace Briggs, and he told Briggs in a voice that didn't rise that he was going to apologize to her, and he was going to do it now. Briggs laughed, the way a man laughs at something that has surprised him more than it has threatened him, and then his face changed, hardening into something colder. "Jake Hollis," he said loudly, so the whole room could hear it. 8 years behind on modernizing that shop of his, carrying a note that's been extended twice already out of pure charity on my part. And now he wants to lecture me about manners in front of the whole town. He looked at Jake directly, his voice dropping into something almost conversational, which somehow made it worse. "You want to keep that shop open through the winter, Hollis? You'll sit back down and mind whose floor you're standing on." Jake didn't sit down. He said that a shop wasn't worth having if he had to watch a man treat a woman like garbage to keep it. And he said it plainly, without heat, the way you say something you've already made peace with losing. Briggs's jaw worked for a moment, a small muscle jumping at his temple. He told Jake in front of everyone that he'd have papers on his desk calling the note by the end of the month, accelerating the whole balance, and that he hoped whatever he was defending here was worth what it was about to cost him and his daughter both. Then he straightened his jacket, told Ruth he'd be in touch about the diner's own arrangements before the month was out, and walked out, the bell over the door ringing behind him in a room that stayed silent for a long time after he'd gone. Carly knelt down to gather the broken cups. Jake knelt beside her without being asked, and the two of them picked pieces of ceramic off the floor together, while the rest of the diner slowly found its voice again in low, careful murmurs. Neither of them said anything until every piece was in the trash bin behind the counter. Jake looked at her for a moment longer than the moment required and told her she didn't have to thank him, and Carly, wiping her hands on her apron, told him she wasn't going to because thanking him felt too small for what he'd just done, and neither of them had the words yet for what would feel right instead. She lay awake that night at her mother's kitchen table again. The diner's mortgage folder Elton had shown her spread open beside the brass key from the cigar box, and for the first time she let herself wonder, without yet being able to prove anything, whether the two pieces of paper sitting in front of her were more connected than a coincidence of timing. She thought of Wallace's face in the diner, the particular practiced cruelty of it, and wondered how long a man had to practice something like that before it stopped costing him anything at all to use. The recognition came 3 days later, in the kitchen after closing. The fryers still ticking as they cooled, the radio playing low from the shelf above the sink. Carly reached up to pull down a stack of clean mugs, and the sleeve of her shirt slid back far enough to show a small pale scar across her palm, the kind you get from a fall off a bicycle at 14, the kind Jake Hollis had held that exact hand and pressed a bandage against on a gravel road outside town a lifetime ago, the summer they were both 15, before either of them understood what they were to each other. He was drying glasses beside her, and he stopped completely, the towel going still in his hands, and he stood there looking at her hand for what felt to both of them like a very long time, and when he finally looked up at her face, really looked, the way you look at something you'd stopped letting yourself see, his own face went through something like grief and something like disbelief at the same time, color draining and then rushing back. He said her name, not Carly, but the full name, the one nobody in this town had used in 25 years, and it came out of him rough, half a question and half a fact he was only now allowing himself to believe. Carly set the mugs down very carefully, because her hands weren't steady anymore, and she told him yes, it was her, and she was sorry, and she didn't know how to say the rest of it in a kitchen with the fryers still ticking as they cooled, and 25 years of silence sitting between them like a third person in the room. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood there with the towel forgotten in his hands. Then he asked her quietly why she'd let him stand there for 2 months not knowing, why she'd let him talk about his daughter and his shop and his dead wife to a stranger who had once been the only girl he'd ever planned to marry. That was the part that cut deepest, more than the disguise itself. He hadn't just been kept in the dark. He'd handed over pieces of himself, quietly and without armor, to someone who already held pieces of him she'd never given back. She told him the truth, or as much of it as she'd worked out for herself, that she'd come home to bury her mother and stayed because she needed somewhere ordinary to grieve, and that somewhere in the middle of it she'd stopped being able to walk away from watching who he'd become. He asked her, his voice cracking on the question if any of it had been real, any of the mornings, any of the talking, any of the two of them slowly becoming something again. She told him all of it had been real, every single morning of it, and that the only thing that hadn't been real was her name tag. They didn't resolve it that night. There was too much sitting between them for one kitchen conversation to carry, 25 years of two people believing two different, incomplete stories about why the other one had let go first. Jake left without another word, not angry exactly, just overwhelmed, and Carly stood alone in the closed diner for a long time afterward, listening to the sound of his truck pulling out of the gravel lot, wondering if she'd just lost him twice. It took nearly 2 weeks before either of them was ready to speak again, beyond what the counter required. 2 weeks of careful, polite distance that hurt worse than an argument would have. And in that stretch of time, Carly threw herself into the only thing she could still control, which was pushing Elton toward finishing the estate paperwork so the safe deposit box could finally be opened. He called her on a grey Wednesday to say the registration had cleared enough to proceed, provided she came in person and provided the bank's own signing officer processed it, a formality that meant walking into Wallace Briggs's own building and putting her full legal name, and the name of her company as part of the standard estate documentation, onto a form his own staff would file and keep on record. She thought little of that requirement beyond irritation at having to set foot in that particular building again so soon after watching him knock a tray from her hands. She had no way of knowing yet what that single signature would eventually cost her. She went alone that same afternoon, signed what needed signing at a teller window while a young clerk processed it without ceremony, barely glancing at the name on the form, and carried the small brass box back out to her car before she let herself open it, sitting in the bank's own parking lot with the engine off, unable to wait even the 10 minutes it would have taken to get home. Rain beginning to spot the windshield in slow, fat drops. Inside, wrapped together with a rubber band gone brittle with age, were 3 things. A stack of letters, a dozen of them, addressed in handwriting she would have known anywhere. Jake's handwriting from 25 years ago. Every single one still sealed, never opened, stamped in red ink along the corner. Return to sender. Address not found. Beneath the letters, a single folded sheet of legal paper. Brittle at the creases, a rough deed transfer describing a small parcel of land at the bend of Miller's Creek, signed by Robert Mercer, dated the same year Carly had left for college, with a blank line beneath it where a second signature, Eleanor's, had never been added. And beneath that, a plain white envelope with Carly's name written across the front in her mother's unmistakable hand, sealed, dated only 8 months before she died. Carly read her mother's letter first, sitting in that parking lot until the light started to go grey outside the windshield, rain running in thin lines down the glass. Eleanor wrote that she'd found the sealed letters and the unsigned deed among Robert's things years after his own death, Going through a box of old business papers she'd never had the heart to sort before, tucked behind tax records in a filing cabinet in the garage she'd been meaning to clean out for a decade. She hadn't understood at first what she was looking at. Once she had, she wrote, she hadn't known how to undo it, or how to tell her daughter without unmaking the father Carly had loved and grieved. She wrote that Robert had gone to the bank the year Carly left for college, desperate, the farm behind on payments after a bad harvest and a stretch of Eleanor's own medical bills. The insurance hadn't fully covered, and that Wallace Briggs, younger then but already ambitious, already circling the small parcel at Miller's Creek, that the Mercers had let the Dawes family use for their diner, under nothing more than a handshake for 2 generations, had offered Robert an easy loan on one condition, spoken rather than written. That same parcel would pass to the bank if the loan ever went unpaid. Robert agreed, never fully understanding or never wanting to understand, that the land wasn't entirely his to pledge, that Eleanor's name sat beside his on the original deed, and her signature had never once been sought for any of it. Eleanor wrote, too, that in that same terrible year, Robert had convinced himself, with Wallace's quiet encouragement over conversations she'd only pieced together decades later from things Robert let slip near the end of his own life, in low, half-conscious moments in the last weeks of his illness, that Carly needed to leave Milbrook Hollow entirely and never look back, that a mechanic's son would only anchor her to the same small, struggling life Robert himself had never managed to escape, despite a lifetime of trying. Wallace, she wrote, had a particular talent for making a frightened man feel wise for the very decisions that kept him grateful and indebted, framing it always as fatherly concern rather than what it plainly was, and Robert, scared and proud in equal measure, had let himself be talked further into a corner than he ever admitted to anyone, including, she suspected, himself. Robert intercepted Jake's letters that first year, one by one, before Carly ever saw them. Driving to the post office himself most mornings, that whole autumn under the excuse of picking up the farm's mail. He told Jake's mother, in a conversation neither family ever spoke of again, that Carly had chosen a bigger life and didn't want to hear from home. Eleanor closed the letter, asking her daughter's forgiveness for the years of silence that followed her own discovery of all this. Silence born, not of indifference, but of not knowing how to hand her only child a truth that would break open everything Carly believed about the father she'd buried with love intact. She asked her, if it wasn't too late, to find out whether the boy who used to sit on their porch steps still had any of himself left to give. Carly sat in that parking lot until it was fully dark before she could bring herself to drive home. The letter creased where her hands had gripped it too tightly, rain still tapping steady against the roof of the car. She brought everything to Jake the following evening, not as proof of anything, just as the truth laid out plainly on his own kitchen table while Sarah did homework upstairs, the television murmuring low in the next room, a pot of coffee going cold between them that neither touched. He opened one of the letters with hands that weren't entirely steady and read his own 25-year-old handwriting for the first time as a grown man, and something in his face broke open in a way Carly had never seen, not even the night he'd recognized her. He told her after a long silence that his mother, near the end of her life, had said something to him once that he'd never understood, sitting in a hospital bed with her hands folded, something about wishing she'd asked more questions about the letters that never got answered before she'd told him to let it go and move forward with his life. He'd let it pass at the time as an old woman's confusion, one more thing grief did to a failing mind. It hadn't been confusion. It had been the one thread of guilt she'd never had the courage to pull all the way, the thing she'd carried quietly to her own grave, the way Robert had carried his. Neither Carly nor Jake had abandoned the other. They had both been abandoned by decisions made on their behalf, by people who told themselves in some fashion they were protecting the two people they loved most, and who had been wrong in ways that cost 25 years neither of them could get back. Jake reached across the table and took her hand, the one with the small pale scar, and neither of them said anything for a long while, because some griefs, once finally understood, don't need words right away. They just need to be sat with, together, in a kitchen with a stack of letters between them that had waited 25 years to finally be read. It should have been the beginning of something easier. It wasn't, not yet. Wallace Briggs, reviewing standard paperwork that crossed his desk as a matter of routine weeks later. The very estate form Carly had signed to access her mother's box recognized the name of her company from a regional business article he'd glanced at years earlier without much attention at the time, a feature on rising Nashville firms he'd read once in a dentist's waiting room and half forgotten. He didn't hesitate. Within days, the whole town knew that the new Waitress was, in fact, worth more than the entire county's tax base combined, and Wallace made sure the story traveled framed exactly the way that would do the most damage. A rich woman playing dress-up, watching the town, watching Jake in particular to see how they'd behave when they thought nobody important was looking. He said it loud enough and often enough at his own counter, and to anyone who'd listen at the diner and the hardware store both, that it reached Jake second-hand before Carly ever got the chance to tell him herself, the particular cruelty of a rumor arriving before the truth does. It hit Jake harder than Carly expected, and harder than she'd let herself worry about. It wasn't the money itself. It was the shape it put on everything that had happened between them since the recognition. The sick possibility that the last several weeks had been some kind of test he hadn't known he was taking. That she'd been observing his grief, his poverty, his daughter, from a position of complete safety the entire time. The same safety net that meant nothing that happened to him could ever really touch her the way it touched him. He didn't say much about it directly. He just pulled back, the way a careful man pulls back from something that might already have burned him once, something in him that had learned, the hard way, 25 years ago, exactly how much it cost to trust her fully and then lose her without warning. He stopped coming in for his 6:40 coffee. Sarah, angrier than her father, cornered Carly by the register one afternoon and asked, her voice shaking, how she could have let all of them, her father especially, believe a lie for 2 whole months. And Carly had no answer that felt like enough against a 16-year-old's plain, fair fury. Carly gave Jake the space because she understood the instinct. Even as it broke her heart a little more each morning, his booth sat empty. Each morning she wiped down a Formica table that no longer held his coffee cup, and she turned instead to finishing what the box had started. Elton confirmed, after a careful review of the county's original deed records down at the courthouse, exactly what Eleanor's letter had already told her. The Millers Creek parcel had always carried 2 names, Robert's and Eleanor's both, filed together on a deed from 1962, and only one of them had ever signed anything away. Whatever verbal understanding Robert Mercer believed he'd struck with Wallace Briggs a quarter-century earlier had never carried legal weight, not for a single day, because the woman who owned half of it had never once been asked. Wallace, sensing the ground shifting under him as word of the deed's true history began, slowly and carefully, to move through the right ears, the way word always moved through Milbrook Hollow, pushed harder rather than backing down, moving to formalize the bank's claim on the parcel using the old rough transfer as his basis, confident that a 25-year-old signature was still enough to settle the matter quietly, the way it had always been enough before, because nobody had ever looked closely enough at the missing line to notice it mattered. He also, in the same stretch of weeks, accelerated the diner's own note, sending Ruth formal notice that the balance would be called in full within 30 days unless new arrangements were made on his terms, arrangements that Elton, reviewing the letter with a tightness in his jaw Carly hadn't seen from him before, called nothing short of an attempt to force Ruth out entirely, while the town's attention was still tangled up in gossip about Carly's money. The confrontation happened where it had to happen, back at the Bluebird itself, on a morning when Wallace came in personally to finalize what he still believed was a settled matter, papers in hand, expecting Ruth to sign without a fight the way she always had before. Carly was waiting for him instead, the unsigned deed and Eleanor's letter laid out on the counter between them, Jake standing beside her, having come back that same morning for reasons of his own that had nothing to do with what he now found waiting there. Drawn simply by an ache he hadn't been able to argue himself out of, Ruth watching from the kitchen door with her hands pressed flat against her apron, Sarah slipping quietly in through the side door a few minutes later, drawn by word moving fast the way it always did. Carly didn't raise her voice. She told him plainly in front of the room that had gathered the way rooms in a town this size always gather, that the parcel his bank was trying to claim had never legally belonged to her father alone, that her mother's signature had never once been on that line, and that the debt he'd used for 25 years to hold this town in place had been built from the very beginning, on a promise nobody had the right to make. Wallace tried the same tone he'd always used, told her she was an outsider making trouble, that paper this old didn't matter anymore, that nobody in this town would take her word over his after 3 decades of trust. But Ruth herself, 74 years old, stepped out from behind the counter before anyone else could speak and told Wallace Briggs, in front of everyone, that she'd trusted him with her family's whole life's work for 18 years, and she wasn't going to trust him with one more day of it. Not after what he'd just tried to take from a dead woman's daughter, using a paper that was never his to hold. Her voice shook on the last few words, not from fear this time, but from something closer to fury, 4 decades in the making. Wallace Briggs did not leave that morning quietly. He argued, he threatened vaguely, he told the room this would end up costing all of them more than they understood. But within the month, with the deed's true history now a matter of county record, and the bank's own board quietly and separately informed of exactly how their president had spent 3 decades leaning on people with nowhere else to borrow from, he was gone from First County Bank entirely. A resignation the board dressed up in careful language that fooled nobody in Milbrook Hollow, and he never set foot in the Bluebird diner again. He sold his house 8 months later and left the county altogether, and the town, Carly noticed, spoke of him afterward the way people speak of weather that has finally passed, with relief rather than triumph. What followed wasn't the fantasy of Carly writing checks to fix everything, and she made a quiet point in those weeks of making sure it never became that story in anyone's mind, including her own. She didn't pay off Jake's note. She didn't buy him a shop or hand him a gift dressed up as gratitude. The bank's own internal review, once new leadership started looking honestly at Wallace's lending record, corrected Jake's note back to the fair terms he'd actually signed for years earlier entirely on its own initiative, because the terms had never been legitimate to begin with, and Jake got back what had always been his, rather than receiving something new from her. Ruth's diner's fraudulent penalties were wiped clean the same way, through the same review, not through Carly's intervention. The Miller's Creek parcel, cleared at last of any bank claim, passed properly to Carly as Eleanor's heir, and Carly, rather than asserting anything over it or reminding anyone what she now legally held, simply sat down with Ruth one quiet afternoon and turned the old handshake arrangement into a real, permanent lease at a token rent, so the ground under the Bluebird could never again be used as leverage by anyone who came after. Jake came back to the Bluebird for good on a Tuesday morning at 6:40, 3 weeks after everything came apart in the open. 3 weeks he'd spent sitting with all of it, turning it over on long drives and longer nights after Sarah went to bed. He told her he'd needed the time, not because he doubted what had happened between them, but because he'd needed to be sure it was real and not gratitude wearing love's clothes, not relief at finally having his note corrected, mistaken for something deeper. She told him she understood, because she'd needed exactly that kind of certainty once herself, 25 years of needing it, and that she wasn't going anywhere this time, not because money made staying easier, but because she'd finally found her way back to the one thing money had never once been able to buy her in all those years away. A town, and a man in it, that had never stopped mattering. Sarah took longer to come around, the way 16-year-olds do when trust has been spent carelessly with something that mattered to them, but she came around in her own time, in her own booth by the window, doing homework while Carly poured coffee on slow afternoons for no reason but the weight of a full pot and a familiar counter. And somewhere in the second year she stopped being angry about the 2 months of not knowing and started, instead, teasing Carly gently about the coffee order she'd apparently had memorized before either of them knew who the other really was. By the time Sarah left for community college 2 towns over, she'd taken to calling Carly most Sunday evenings just to talk, a habit neither of them had planned and both of them had come to depend on. Ruth ran the Bluebird 2 more years before her knees finally won the argument she'd been losing slowly for a decade, and when she finally handed the keys over, on a spring morning with the whole town somehow crowded into the diner to see it happen, she handed them to Carly and Jake together, not as an inheritance bought with wealth, but as something earned the slow way, weekend by weekend, over a counter they'd rebuilt with their own hands from cracked formica up. Ruth still came in most mornings after that, sitting in her old spot near the register, Drinking coffee she no longer had to pour herself, and nobody who saw her there ever once suggested she'd truly left. Carly kept Meridian running from Nashville 3 days a week, a capable team back home that no longer needed her, hovering over every decision, and spent the rest of her time in Milbrook Hollow, and neither she nor Jake rushed the remainder of it, because they had already learned, the hardest possible way, exactly what 25 years cost when two people let someone else decide their story for them without ever being asked. They married 2 years after Ruth handed over the diner, a small ceremony at the same church where Eleanor's funeral had been held, Sarah standing beside her father, Ruth in the front pew in the handkerchief that had once been Eleanor's own. Some evenings, walking the old county road past the water tower where they used to meet as teenagers, past the fence line and the railroad crossing that hadn't changed at all. They didn't talk much at all, because the silence between them had finally become the easy kind, the kind two people only earn by making it, at last, and entirely on their own terms, all the way back to each other.